Well, good evening, everyone. Luckily, I got finished tonight a bit earlier. I've got to reschedule some lessons for later on in the week. So therefore, can crack straight on with part two, which makes life very easy for me because I've still got the article up at the point where I left off. And I don't know how genuine people were when they were saying that they really liked the shirt, but as you can see, it's still on. This was Father's Day present. They always buy me a rather garish shirt, and I think they've excelled themselves this year. Anyway, let's have a look, as I say, at the second part. I think this will end up being in three parts. The second part of the affidavit of Dr. Richard A. Leo. And let's just carry on from where we left off. I think this is exactly where we were. We were just about to look at part 5, paragraph 18, police-induced false confessions. So in addition to evaluating whether an interrogation was coercive or overborne the will or decision-making ability of a custodial suspect. I think that's really, really important. The overbearing of the will, because that's what we heard for many, many months, wasn't it? Or decision-making ability of a custodial suspect. Interrogation and confession experts are sometimes also asked to evaluate the factors that can lead to false confessions from the innocent and to assess the likelihood that a false confession was elicited in a particular case. As mentioned above, social science researchers have demonstrated that, contrary to popular misperceptions, false confessions from the innocent occur regularly, that psychological methods of interrogation can and do cause the innocent to sometimes confess falsely, that certain methods of interrogation, particularly methods known or demonstrated to exert a coercive effect, are correlated with the likelihood of a false confession, and that there are established principles with which to evaluate the likely reliability of confessions. Well, yes, there's one in particular. Can it be corroborated? And what about the control question? I think I've gone a bit too big there. Doesn't fill the whole screen. Let me just make sure that everything's working as it should, and we'll crack on with the next part of that paragraph. I had this ready earlier. Yes, there we go. There we go. We are on the right page. Okie dokie. It says here, as I say, that there are established principles with which to evaluate the likely reliability of confessions, such as the control question. In addition, social scientists have identified 3 different types of false confessions: voluntary false confessions made in response to minimal or no police pressure, compliant false confessions given to terminate the stressful, punishing and or coercive experience of interrogation by a suspect who privately knows that he is innocent, and persuaded false confessions given by a suspect who comes to doubt the reliability of his memory and comes to believe that he or she may have committed the crimes. Compliant and persuaded false confessions may be either coerced or non-coerced. Like I said earlier, I think with these academics that have spent all their entire career, they've spent their growing up at school, then they've gone to university, they've been involved in the education system all their time. They do get to be very, very knowledgeable on their specific subject. Anyway, Although psychological coercion is the primary cause of interrogation-induced false confessions, some types of individuals, particularly the mentally handicapped and or cognitively impaired, juveniles and the mentally ill, are more vulnerable to the pressures of interrogation and therefore less likely to possess or be able to muster the psychological resources or perspective necessary to withstand accusatorial questioning. In particular, the mentally handicapped and impaired possess personality characteristics that increase their risk of interrogation-induced false confession. Because of their cognitive deficits and limited social skills, the mentally handicapped and cognitively impaired are slow-thinking, easily confused, concrete as opposed to abstract thinkers, often lack the ability to appreciate the seriousness of a situation, may not understand the long-term consequences of their actions, and tend to have short attention spans, poor memory, and poor impulse control. I think he's just completely summed up Brendan. Anyway, the mentally handicapped and cognitively impaired also tend to be highly submissive, especially eager to please authority figures, compliant, suggestible, and responsive to stress and pressure. As a result, the mentally handicapped and are disproportionately represented in the reported false confession cases. Notwithstanding this fact, the vast majority of reported false confessions are from cognitively and intellectually normal. So in other words, it's not just the ones that are really struggling individuals. So I should have read that all as one sentence. Notwithstanding this fact, the vast majority of reported false confessions are from cognitively and intellectually normal individuals. Juveniles are also disproportionately represented in the reported false confession cases. They are particularly vulnerable to the pressures of psychological interrogation for many of the same reasons as the mentally handicapped. Adolescence is associated with psychological traits such as greater suggestibility, impulsiveness, emotional arousability, and a tendency to focus on the present rather than the future. These psychological tendencies of youth significantly increase the risk of false confessions. The risks are compounded by the fact that although police officers may realize that juvenile suspects are easily influenced, interrogators often apply the same interrogation tactics on juveniles that they use on adults. Regrettably, most police interrogators receive no training about the problem and consequences of police-induced false confessions in the American criminal justice system. Most police receive no training in the basics of false confessions, i.e. that normal people can be made to falsely confess in response to contemporary psychological police interrogation methods. Most police are not taught which of their techniques are likely to cause false confessions and why, how to recognize false confessions, or how to prevent false confessions from occurring in the first place. Most detectives receive no special training in how to interrogate children, juveniles, or the mentally retarded. As a result, most police interrogators appear to share the public misconception that false confessions only occur in response to torture or if the suspect is mentally ill, and most police interrogators refuse to acknowledge the possibility that they may have elicited a wholly or partially false incriminating statement, admission, or confession in one of their cases. Section 6. Evaluating the reliability of incriminating statements, admissions, and confessions. The principles of post-admission narrative analysis and incriminating statements, admissions, and confessions. Social science researchers apply well-known, well-established and widely accepted principles of analysis to evaluate the likely reliability or unreliability of an incriminating statement, admission or full confession from a suspect. To evaluate the likely reliability of such statements, researchers analyze the fit between the suspect's post-admission narrative, the story or account the suspect tells following the "I did it" admission statement, and the crime facts and or corroborating evidence derived from the confession, e.g. location of the missing murder weapon, loot from a robbery, the victim's missing clothing, etc. The purpose of evaluating the fit between a suspect's post-admission narrative and the underlying crime facts and derivative crime evidence is to test the suspect's actual knowledge of the crime. If the suspect's post-admission narrative corroborates details only the police know, i.e. have not been made public, leads to new or previously undiscovered evidence of guilt, explains apparent crime fact anomalies, and or is corroborated by independent facts and evidence, then the suspect's post-admission narrative objectively demonstrates that he possesses the actual knowledge that would be known only by the true perpetrator. This unique knowledge is strong evidence of guilt. This, of course, assumes that the suspect's knowledge of the crime has not been contaminated by the media, community gossip, or by the police themselves. If the suspect cannot provide police with the actual details of the crime, fails to accurately describe the crime scene facts, cannot lead the police to new or derivative crime evidence, and or provides an account that is full of gross errors and disconfirmed by the independent case evidence, then the suspect's post-admission narrative demonstrates that he fails to possess the actual knowledge that would be known only by the true perpetrator. I really wish Tom Fassbender and Mark Weigert had tuned in to listen to that paragraph. But anyway, this lack of knowledge is therefore strongly consistent with a judgment of innocence. Now, the fit between the suspect's post-admission narrative and both the crime scene facts and the derivative crime evidence therefore provides an objective basis for evaluating the likely reliability of the suspect's incriminating statements. The well-established and widely accepted social science research principle of using the fit standard to evaluate the validity of a confession statement is also a bedrock principle of criminal investigation within law enforcement. Properly trained police detectives realize that an "I did it" statement is not necessarily evidence of guilt and may instead turn out to be evidence of innocence. For example, in high-profile murder cases, police regularly screen out volunteered confessions by seeing whether or not the person can tell the police details known only to the perpetrator or lead the police to derivative crime evidence that either corroborates or fails to demonstrate the person's guilty knowledge. If an element of a crime is particularly heinous or novel, police often keep this fact from the press so that it can be used to demonstrate a confessor's guilty knowledge. Police sometimes deliberately include an error in media releases or allow incorrect statements to go uncorrected so that a true perpetrator will be able to demonstrate his personal knowledge of the crime. In other types of cases, police detectives regularly rely upon the standard fit to identify a true admission that might be mixed in with a collection of volunteered statements. Using the fit standard to evaluate the validity of a suspect's incriminating statements, admissions, or confessions is a bedrock principle of law enforcement because police detectives realize that seeking corroboration during the post-admission phase of interrogation is essential to proper investigative work. It is a fundamental principle of police investigation, and that true explanations can be supported and false explanations cannot be supported, assuming no contamination has occurred. False explanations will not fit the facts of the crime, lead to derivative evidence, or be corroborated by independent evidence. Moreover, post-admission narrative analysis and the fit standard are central to proper criminal investigation because properly trained detectives realize that the purpose of detective work is not to clear a crime or get a conviction, but to carefully collect evidence in a way that will lead to the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of the guilty. Simultaneously, the post-admission narrative analysis and the fit standard ensure that no innocent individual is wrongfully arrested, prosecuted, or convicted. A suspect's post-admission narrative, therefore, provides a goldmine of potential evidence to the unbiased, properly trained detective who is seeking to ferret out the truth. For if the suspect is guilty, the collection of a detailed post-admission narrative will allow the detective to establish the suspect's guilt beyond question, both by demonstrating the suspect's actual knowledge and by corroborating the suspect's statements with derivative evidence. Properly trained detectives realize that the strongest form of corroboration comes through the development of new evidence using a suspect's post-admission narrative. While it is not possible to verify every post-admission narrative with the crime facts, a skillful interrogator will seek as much verifiable information about the crime as he can elicit. The more verifiable information elicited from a suspect during the post-admission period, and the better it fits with the crime facts, the more clearly the suspect demonstrates his responsibility for the crime. If the suspect is innocent, the detective can use the suspect's post-admission narrative to establish his lack of knowledge and thus demonstrate his likely or certain innocence. Whereas a guilty suspect can corroborate his admission because of his actual knowledge of the crime, the innocent suspect cannot. The more information the interrogator seeks, the more frequently and clearly an innocent suspect will demonstrate his ignorance of the crime. His answers will turn out either to be wrong, to defy evaluation, or to be of no value for discriminating between guilt and innocence, assuming that neither the investigator nor the media have contaminated the suspect by transferring information about the crime facts, or that the extent of contamination is known. The likelihood that his answers will be correct should be no better than chance. The only time an innocent person will contribute correct information is when he makes an unlucky guess. The likelihood of an unlucky guess diminishes as the number of possible answers to an investigator's questions grow large. If, however, his answers about missing evidence are proven wrong, he cannot supply verifiable information that should be known to the perpetrator, and he inaccurately describes verifiable crime facts, then the post-admission narrative provides evidence of innocence. Section 7. The problem of contamination. The post-admission narrative process is about more than merely eliciting information from the suspect. Investigators are trained to shape the suspect's narrative to make the confession as persuasive as possible and to enhance the chances of conviction. In this way, confessions are scripted or constructed by interrogators. A persuasive crime narrative requires an explanation of why the crime happened, the motives and explanations of the suspect for committing the crime. It should also contain a statement of the suspect's emotions, not only his or her emotions at the time of committing the crime, but also the shame, regret, or remorse the suspect now feels for having committed the crime. Interrogators are also trained to get the suspect to cleanse the interrogation process, usually by providing statements to the effect that the confession was voluntary. Interrogators will ask the suspect, usually after the suspect's resistance has been broken down and he has been made to believe that it is in his best interest to confess, whether the suspect was treated well, given food and drink, bathroom breaks and other comforts, and whether any promises or threats were made to the suspect. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the confession must contain both general and specific crime knowledge, the details of the crime that only the true perpetrator should know. The problem of contamination in false confession cases arises when the interrogator pressures a suspect during the post-admission narrative phase to accept a particular account of the crime story, one that usually squares with the interrogator's theory of how the crime occurred, and then suggests, deliberately or inadvertently, crime facts to the suspect. The presence of these facts in the suspect's confession gives the suspect's narrative credibility and the appearance of corroboration. If the interrogation process is not electronically recorded, the interrogator is free to assert that these crime facts were volunteered by the suspect, and the trial devolves into a swearing contest between the suspect and the interrogators over who was the source of the details in the confession. If the entire process is recorded, however, then it may be possible to trace the contamination. I think we know where this might be leading. Contamination by interrogators is only one of several possible sources of contamination. Suspects can learn crime facts from the media, from conversations with others in the community, from the rumor mill, or may simply possess knowledge of the crime facts because they live at or near the crime scene or were present at the crime scene shortly after the crime occurred. In applying the fit test to assess the reliability of the confession, therefore, it is essential to separate out the contaminated facts from the facts that unquestionably were provided by the defendant. Now, we're not even halfway through, so we'll keep going for a little bit longer because we're now getting to the, if you like, the the chorizo either side of the eggs. But no, so the meat in the sandwich. So, section 8. The interrogations and statements of Brendan Dassey. The interrogation of Brendan Dassey on February the 27th, 2006 involved some of the interrogation techniques and strategies laid out above. For example, Special Agent Tom Fassbender and Investigator Mark Wiegert, forever to be known as Bert and Ernie, initially accused Brendan Dassey of helping Stephen Avery start the fire. They alleged his initial denials. They challenged his initial denials. They accused him of lying. They confronted him with alleged evidence of his guilt. They pretended to be all-knowing with respect to Brendan's alleged involvement. They repeated their accusations and challenges to his denials, escalating the pressure on him to comply. And they used a range of inducements to elicit Brendan's initial incriminating statements. These inducements included, for example, appeals to conscience and morality, blaming Stephen Avery for the death and mutilation, minimizing the moral seriousness of Brendan's involvement and blameworthiness. It's not your fault. Remember that. Page 451. You've done nothing wrong. Page 453. Falsely claiming to be Brendan's friend. I'm a father that as a kid your age too. I want to be here for you. There's nothing I'd like to do more than come over and give you a hug because I know you're hurting. Page 433. And offering an affirmatively help and offering to affirmatively help Brendan. We're here to help you. Page 443. Mark and I are not going to leave you high and dry. Page 451. In addition, Fassbender and Wiegert raised the prospect and thus clearly communicated that Brendan could be arrested and charged with the crime if he did not provide them with an acceptable account through the use of systemic inducements. No, I remember reading all of this. We've got people back at the sheriff's office, district attorney's office, and they're looking at this now, saying there's no way Brendan Dassey was out there and didn't see something. They're talking about trying to link Brendan Dassey with this event. They're not saying that Brendan did it. They're saying that Brendan had something to do with it, or the cover-up of it, which would mean Brendan Dassey could potentially be facing charges for that. February 27th, interrogation, page 442. And again, we've got a lot of information and some people don't care. Some people back there say, no, we'll just charge him. We said, no, let us talk to him. Give him the opportunity to come forward with the information that he has and get it off of his chest. Now make it look. You can make it look however you want. Page 443. And again, Mark and I both can go back to the district attorney and say, Dassey came forward and finally told us. Can you imagine how this was weighing on him? They'll understand that. Page 448. Fassbender and Wiegert thus used both standard, non-coercive interrogation techniques as well as inducements that were psychologically coercive insofar as they communicated the threat of possible arrest, charges and punishment if Brendan did not provide the desired account, and implied that he could avoid this and get help if he did provide the desired account. In their subsequent interrogations, Bert and Ernie continued to occasionally use inducements that communicated that Brendan would receive more favourable treatment from the detectives or the criminal justice system if he provided the account they desired, and less favourable treatment if he did not. For example, Fassbender told Brendan, we just need to hear the whole story from you. As soon as we get that and we're comfortable with that, I think you're going to be a lot more comfortable with that. It's going to be a lot easier on you down the road, if this goes to trial and stuff like that. Also, Bert or Ernie, can never decide which is which, told Brendan, I'm your friend right now, but I got to believe in you. And if I don't believe in you, I can't go to bat for you. March 1st, page 547. Throughout the March 1st interrogation, Fassbender and Wiegert conveyed absolute confidence in their assertions of Brendan's guilt, repeatedly telling him that they already knew what happened. This was a false evidence ploy. They did not, in fact, know what had happened, and they still don't know what. Well, maybe they do know what happened and are simply not wanting to tell anybody because it doesn't fit with what their job was to do. They had a theory of how the crime had occurred, but did not have any evidence linking Brendan to the crime. Nevertheless, they accused Brendan repeatedly of lying, refused to accept the possibility that he was innocent, and confronted him with their so-called superior knowledge of how the crime had occurred. April 20th, transcript at 1:01. April 21st, transcript at 6, 7, 22 and 37. In addition to the false evidence ploy of superior knowledge, Wiegert admitted to employing all of the following techniques when he testified at Brendan's trial. Deception, April 20th, transcript at 14 to 15, 65 to 66. Trying to befriend Brendan, 16. Purposely invading Brendan's personal space and touching him on the knee to take him out of his comfort zone, making numerous promises to him, using minimization by attempting to persuade Brendan that what he did was okay and that it was not his fault or that Stephen made him do it, leading to all suggestive questioning and repeatedly accusing Brendan of lying. These techniques can and sometimes do lead innocent suspects to falsely implicate themselves in crimes they did not technique. These techniques might be especially impactful on an individual who is unusually susceptible to the pressures of interrogation. We know from the research literature that juveniles and the mentally handicapped are disproportionately vulnerable to false confession for a host of psychosocial reasons that leave them more compliant and suggestible than others. According to the materials I reviewed, Brendan Dassey, who was 16 years old at the time of this interrogation, possesses low intelligence, passive demeanor, below average cognitive abilities, and limited mental functioning, all traits that leave him highly susceptible to making or agreeing to false admissions or confessions in an accusatory police interrogation. This cluster of personality traits also makes Dassey highly susceptible to believing police interrogators' suggestions that leniency will follow from confession and harm will follow from denial. Once Bert and Ernie had elicited Brendan's admission that he had seen the body, February 27th interrogation, page 458, they used highly suggestive post-admission interrogation techniques in which they relied on leading questions, prompted Brendan with desired answers, corrected him, and pressured him to agree to and provide an account that matched their theory of how the crime occurred. For example, in the February 27th interrogation, Fassbender and Wiegert suggested to Brendan that he saw Teresa Holbach's bones and body parts in the fire and later suggested specific body parts not included in his account, and he agreed. In the March 1st interrogation, Bert and Ernie quite remarkably asked Brendan to tell them what Stephen did to Teresa Holbach, telling him that it was something with the head. And apparently that was in the March 1st interrogation. Brendan appeared to venture several guesses, first stating that Avery cut off her hair, then that Avery punched her, and then that Avery made Brendan cut her throat. But none of these answers were what the detectives were looking for. And when Brendan told the detectives he could not remember anything else, they told him Teresa was shot in the head. All right, I'm just going to come out and ask you, who shot her in the head? March 1st interrogation, page 587. In the May 13th interrogation, Bert and Ernie convinced Brendan to change the location of the murder from what he had previously said in his March 1st statement, that it occurred in Avery's bedroom, to that she was killed in the garage, after forensic testing established that Brendan's March 1st statement was false. Dr. Larry White's report contains many more examples of the detectives' use of suggestion, leading questions, and pressures on Brendan to provide the answers they wanted in their post-admission interrogations. The May 13th interrogation is perhaps the best evidence not only of Brendan's suggestibility, but also of the fact that the investigators knew Brendan was not telling them the truth, but rather what he thought they wanted to hear. May 13th interrogation, page 32, 58 to 59, and 88. related to the issue of whether Burton Ernie's pre-admission and post-admission interrogation techniques were psychologically improper or improperly suggestive. There is the issue of reliability. As mentioned above, researchers and experts evaluate the likely reliability of interrogation-induced statements by analysing their fit with the physical evidence and whether the suspect can provide non-public details not likely guessed by chance and/or lead police to new, missing, or derivative evidence absent contamination. In this case, Brendan Dassey provided no unique, non-public details of the Halbach murder. All of the details in Brendan's statements were provided to him by Burton Ernie or publicly known. They were contaminated or easily guessed by chance. In other words, the details in Brendan's interrogation-induced statements do not corroborate the veracity of his admissions. I wondered when we would find out who Joseph Buckley was, and here we do. The state retained Joseph Buckley, the president of John E. Reed and Associates, one of the most well-known interrogation training firms in the United States, to analyze the voluntariness and reliability of Brendan's March 1st confession. In his report, dated April 4th, 2007, Joseph Buckley stated that the promises made by Burton Ernie do not constitute impermissible promises of leniency, but rather sincere interest in working with Brendan to tell the truth about what happened concerning the murder of Teresa Halbach. He also stated that neither the mere word nor the fact that the suspect was perhaps influenced by wishful thinking that he would receive lenient treatment should determine whether a confession was voluntary. There are two problems, only two? Oh, okay. Two main ones, I presume, with Mr. Buckley's conclusions in this regard. First, Mr. Buckley routinely claims that suspects engage in wishful thinking when they correctly infer implicit promises of leniency from certain techniques, i.e. minimization, that Reed and Associates trains police to use. Claiming that the suspect is engaging in wishful thinking in response to interrogation techniques that are designed to communicate leniency in exchange for confession is essentially blaming the victim. Second, as mentioned above, Burton Ernie used inducements that clearly communicated early in the interrogation that Brendan would receive more lenient treatment from the detectives and the criminal justice system if he cooperated, and confessed, and clearly threatened an adverse outcome if he did not. For example, we're here to help you. We've got people back at the sheriff's office, district attorney's office, and they're looking at this now saying there's no way Brendan Dassey was out there and didn't see something. They're talking about trying to link Brendan Dassey with this event. They're not saying that Brendan did it. They're saying that Brendan had something to do with it or the cover-up of it, which would mean Brendan Dassey could potentially be facing charges for that. We've got a lot of information and some people don't care. Some people back there say, no, we'll discharge him. We said, no, let us talk to him. Give him the opportunity to come forward with the information that he has and get it off his chest. Now make it look. You can make it look however you want. Mark and I both can go back to the district attorney and say, Dassey came forward and finally told us. Can you imagine how this was weighing on him? They'll understand that. We just need to hear the whole story from you. As soon as we get that, and we're comfortable with that, I think you're going to be a lot more comfortable with that. It's going to be a lot easier on you down the road. if this goes to trial and stuff like that. I'm your friend right now, but I got to believe in you. And if I don't believe in you, I can't go back for you. Mr. Buckley also asserts that Brendan offered details in his March 1st admission that corroborate the veracity of that statement. In particular, Mr. Buckley asserts that there are at least 17 corroborating details offered by Brendan Dassey in his statement. Buckley report. To the contrary, all of the examples of alleged corroboration cited by Buckley are either the product of prompting, suggestion, and contamination by the detectives. Contamination by the media. This was one of the most highly publicized cases in the history of Wisconsin, and numerous details of the police investigation were released to the print and the broadcast media. Guesses that were statistically probable, incorrect guesses that revealed Brendan's ignorance of the true facts rather than any inside or guilty knowledge, or truthful statements that are consistent with Brendan's version of events in which he is not culpable for any crime. To demonstrate this point, it is worth going through each of Mr. Buckley's alleged corroborating details and showing that these details were either suggested by the detectives, available to Brendan through widespread media coverage, the product of likely guesses, or simply consistent with Brendan's version of events and non-incriminating, i.e. Brendan had pre-existing knowledge of the facts for reasons not related to the crime. Now, as I say, we've been going quite a while now, so I think we'll save what's obviously going to be quite an interesting bit. The dismantling of Mr. Buckley. So we're at page 18 at the moment. I think there's 30 pages altogether to this. I might be wrong, but page 18, and we're about to go for Mr. Buckley number 1. Let's say I think Mr. Buckley is mentioned at the very beginning about his report, and I couldn't remember who he was at the time. Where are the mastermind girls when you need them, eh? Not to worry. So I will leave that just there. I will catch you all sometime soon. Hopefully, as I say, the next part of this should be enough to get through to the end, but we'll wait and see. I've had some email correspondence with Richard Leo, and hopefully we're aiming for the first weekend in July, so literally just under a fortnight's time, which will be absolutely brilliant. I know that Mark the Hod Sharp8 would be keen to join us, as would Tracy Keogh, and maybe we can get the dude to join in as well, because I've certainly got a few interesting questions that I would like to ask somebody of Richard Leo's knowledge and expertise. So as I say, we'll leave it at that. I'll catch you all again soon. The link in the description is to earlier video, to part 1. I'll say this is part 2. And then in part 3, I'll leave the link to 1 and 2. Okay. So thanks all for tuning in. I know there's only 4 people watching at the moment. It doesn't matter. It's a bad time. This is 7 o'clock. It's about 1 o'clock in Wisconsin, 11 o'clock on Crunch Island. So at a working hour. So I'll let everybody catch up, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do part 3 sometime tomorrow. If not, then Wednesday. Okay, bye for now.